Hi everyone, I'm Megan, a bookseller at Literati bookstore and the host for tonight's event. This evening, we're pleased to welcome Peter Ho Davies to our At Home with Literati series in support of the art of revision. He'll be in conversation with Steve Woodward. For our attendees, the chat is closed, so I'll be dropping links to purchase the art of revision from Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature in your toolbar to submit questions at any time, and I'll ask a selection of them at the conclusion of the event. A reminder that you can shop for more books in store or at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States. Now allow me to introduce tonight's author and moderator. Peter Ho Davies is the author of 3 novels, including The Lie Someone Told You About Yourself and 2 story collections. The winner of the Graywolf Award and the Penn Malamud Prize. He teaches at the University of Michigan and lives in Ann Arbor. Steve Woodward is a writer and former editor at Graywolf Press. Authors he's edited have won the Booker Prize, MBCC Award, and the International Dublin Literary Award, and have been finalists for the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award. He teaches publishing and creative writing at Macalester College, University of St. Benedict, and Sierra Nevada University, and has an MFA from the University of Michigan. He lives in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Peter and Steve.
Great, thank you, Megan.
Thanks very much, Megan. Great to be here with you, Steve. I was sort of saying, I think in our earlier chat, that it's kind of fantastic to be talking about a book that grows out of teaching with a former MFA who also edited the book. Thank you very much for that. And being introduced by Megan, a former student of mine as well. So it's a really nice space to be in to talk about this book.
That's a great continuum that we're presenting here for this event. So Peter, I think you're going to be leading up top here with a short reading, and then we'll move into conversation.
Yeah, I'm just going to read a couple of pages, and maybe just to frame the conversation a little bit. And I thought I would read these, Steve, because the quote that I begin with here is one that you turned me on to, actually. It's a quote from Benjamin Percy, and I think another Graywolf author, as a matter of fact, as well. So I appreciated the help thinking into this. So here we go. Benjamin Percy makes a productive distinction between revision for novice and experienced writers, and I'm quoting now. When revising, the beginning writer spends hours consulting the thesaurus, replacing a period with a semicolon, cutting adjectives, adding a few descriptive sentences, whereas the professional writer mercilessly lops off limbs, rips out innards like party streamers, drains away gallons of blood, and then calls down the lightning to bring the body back to life. We might list a catalogue of things most of us needed to learn when we were beginners, avoiding the ticky repetitions of certain words, the reliance on cliche, the overuse of adverbs, etc., etc. Many of these small elements of style have to be learned, which is to say that for most of us, they are at some point a feature of revision. The same is true for aspects of technique. When I was starting out, for instance, I didn't include much dialogue in my stories. Beginning writers, I think, have a common tendency to get stuck in a particular mode, telling or showing, and I had to remind myself to incorporate scenes during revision. But that hasn't been true for a long time now. The toggling between modes of scene and narration has become more intuitive, natural even, as I become more practiced. Which is to say that, like Ben Percy, my experience of revision has altered over time as I've revised myself as a writer, so much so that many of those hard-learned skills have become second nature, showing up even in first drafts. And this is good news, of course, but it also suggests that revision is a moving target, hard to pin down and define. Experienced writers still wrestle with revision, but such is the protean nature of the process that it's not the same revision as earlier in their careers. And what's fundamental to revision, I'd suggest, is not what the beginning writer does, but what the experienced writer does. Theoretically, I suppose there might be an infallible writer, one who, with enough experience, writes perfect first drafts, but I doubt it. Even God needed to start over after the flood and apparently still felt the need of a sequel. So what does it mean when a writer who has mastered all the technical skills still needs to revise? What's that essential core of revision? What's left to change? The list of writing tips, however useful, that feature in many articles and manuals about revision then would seem to not tell the whole story. We begin to intuit that revision isn't just a catch-all description for various refinements of craft and style, but a skill in itself, a technique of its own, a state of mind even. What's left to change, it turns out, may be our own approach to revision. So just to set us up there, Steve.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Peter. I'm so glad that you read that passage because there was actually something in there that I wanted to jump in on and
Sure.
and pick your brain a little bit about.
Mm.
I should say before we dive in here that I'd written up a whole biography, right, to introduce you.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
I thought that I may well be the one to do that. And I had ended it with a little grace note about the most germane bit of the biography being that you were my teacher years ago, and that then I was your editor for this book, and the sort of like interconnected nature of that. And how that is really fitting in a sense, because it meant that our own relationship has over the years been itself revised, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So time
and,
is the great reviser of our work and of
right.
us and our lives, right?
Yeah, and so there's something so pleasurable about that. I think one of the things that I really love about the art of revision, and I'm just gonna hold up my copy with all little notes in here. Is that it considers revision not just from a sort of nuts and bolts practical guide, right? How-to guide, right? But thinks of it in a much more expansive kind of way, which we'll hopefully be able to, get to the bottom of here tonight. So, riffing on that notion of time as the reviser, right? And it's ourselves maybe in some ways that need to change. There was a statement in that passage you read where you said that you've revised yourself as a writer. And I was wondering, okay, can you expand on that a little bit more? Can one revise oneself as a writer, or is it merely something that happens over time?
Oh, I think so. That's a really interesting way of thinking. Can we do this sort of programmatically and consciously, or is it something that we just discover in ourselves? And maybe I would say that it's probably a little bit of both, right? I do in general think of writing as a self-discovery process, right? And I would argue that when we're revising our fiction, part of what we are revising is our own understanding of our own fiction, which is to some degree is a sense of our own understanding of ourselves, I think, in various ways. But to go back to your note about how our relationship started in the classroom, as a teacher and a student, that shift, in our relationship to you becoming my editor is, I think, crucial to one of the ways we think about revision, right? It's a shift in the ways we see things, right? Re-seeing is embedded in that idea of revision. And I talk a lot in the book about how, as a writer, we sort of almost have to move from understanding our work and seeing it as the writer of its work to sometimes returning to it as a reader of that work. And I think often in the classroom and through workshop and through the feedback of others, we as the writer are often obliged to see our work through the eyes of various readers. And that seems like a really important shift often. And I'm always excited because I think that reading activity that we bring to bear on each other's work, of course, feels like a way of trying to see our own work anew. So that's part of that, that sense of trying to understand what we may have missed and understanding ourselves in various ways. But I would say, in answer to your question about how have I revised myself as a writer, I think being a teacher has revised me as a writer, right? Yeah. It's obliged me in mostly very productive and exciting ways to think into my own process and then to be able to explain it to others. So that requires me to sort of understand it, to move from a space where I'm intuiting what I'm doing to trying to get to a space where I can begin to rationalize it, understand it, and then furthermore share it with us. And I always think that one of the tests of our knowledge, and this goes back to my days in physics, is the capacity to explain a concept to somebody else, right? We know we understand something if we're able to impart it, whether by teaching or simply through communication, to somebody else.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, right? I do think a lot of writers are intuitive, right? In a way, in terms of what they do. Part of why I was interested in asking you that question about can you revise yourself as a writer is because it seems like that when you enter into, say, a workshop setting, what you're trying to do is actively, learn, right? Expand your understanding of your own craft. Try to have other people tell you what it is that you're doing because you don't know, right? So there is that sense of trying to move past the intuitive into some other space, right? Maybe where you can explain it to someone else. So that's really interesting. I think, expanding on that a little bit, you open the book with a story, right, about your father, that you then return to over and over again, right? And this kind of gives the book a frame and a way to think about revision as telling a story and then retelling that story and telling it again. And it, sort of shifts and change as the person that you are shifts and changes, right? But that also made me think, okay, if we're trying to move from this like intuitive sense into something that's a little bit more, shall we say, rational or practical, and we're often told, oh, okay, you need to be objective, you need some distance, you need fresh eyes, right? All of these terms that tell us like, you actually need, not to be close to or intimate with your own work, but far away from it. But then in this book, you're saying, well, actually, it is personal because the whole thing is wrapped in a very personal story. So that led me to wonder, is all of that traditional advice a little bit wrong-headed?
Oh, I'm not,
revision, inherently a personal act in some sense?
That's a really good way of putting it. And I'm inclined to say the short answer to that would be yes. It's hard work, right? Revising your work, to spend that much time thinking into a work, working hard on it, revising it, changing it, working on it over the course of months and years and drafts. We feel, I know that it's a little bit like banging our heads on the wall. The only way that I think we persevere in that is the sense that it is rewarding to us. We are revising, obviously for publication, obviously for readers, but ultimately, I think for ourselves. That's why, I think I'm resistant in general to the feeling that sometimes comes up in undergraduate classes when I ask students to revise, that revision is kind of a chore. You've had the fun part, the creative part, and now I feel like a little bit in those spaces like mom saying, tidy your room, right? It feels like it's a chore-based activity that you're doing for someone else. But actually, it does feel really important to me that ultimately we revise for ourselves. And that's why the idea of trying to understand our own writing, trying to understand why we do things, trying to understand our intuition feels really central to the way I think into this space. The one thing I would say, just to complicate that argument just a little bit, is it's easy to sometimes think there is this creative energy in the first draft, and everything else beyond that is a rationalization, a way of exploring, maximizing the potentials that's within that text. But I'm also a big believer that revision itself is open to many moments of creativity, and that intuitive sense that you were describing earlier can also aid us in revision. So, my students often hear me talk about how to enter revision, right? After a workshop, after feedback from an editor, we often feel flooded with feedback, right? It's often very useful, but by that same token, it sometimes feels hard to know where to begin, right? So the tariff, the entry price into revision sometimes feels fairly high. We just don't know how to get started. And I'm often interested in lowering that resistance, lowering that tariff so that we can get into revision a little bit more easily and a little bit more swiftly. And so in that vein, I often suggest a couple of very straightforward and simple strategies. One is simply to, address the issues, fix the things that are easy to fix, do the easy stuff first, right? So nearly always when we hear that feedback, I tend to joke that even when we first hand out a story in a workshop, or hit send when we send it off to a competition or a magazine, just the knowledge that other eyes will be on that work often shifts our perspective of that work. And we often, I know I've certainly had these moments, have one of those kind of head slapping moments where you go, oh, I meant to fix that. And it's too late. You've just let it go in the mailbox, you've hit send, you've shared it with the class. But in a sense, you've just begun part of the revision process, even before you've heard a word of feedback, right, in a strange way. And so sometimes when the workshop comes back and says, oh, yes, you should fix that, we go, oh, yeah, I knew that. So that's an easy thing to fix. So those are the places to start, things we agree with, things we can see our way to addressing. But the second step, I think, is to not necessarily next address, the punch list of important things you feel that you ought to, you should address. That again feels like we get back to that chore-based notion of revision. Right. Yeah. I'm really interested in people thinking into what's the most exciting thing you could do with the story now? What of all the feedback you've heard, or separate even to the feedback you've heard, would you most like to do to the story next? The fun thing. And I think that's often that pleasure principle, I suppose, in a certain sense, is an indication of our intuition. And it does feel it's also our intuition saying there's something exciting here. You may not fully perceive it yet, but if you lean into that, that seems like a great direction to move.
Yeah, no, I love that. I wonder how you would respond then to the idea that sometimes you need not to attend to the things that people are telling you to attend to, but to chase them. Because one of the things that I have noticed that can sometimes come out of the space of getting feedback is that there's a tendency for those outside the work to say, let's hammer all the nails down, let's smooth down all the boards. Like, you want the surface of the thing to be as smooth as possible. But then if that is done, sometimes you discover, oh, the very thing that animated the story is now gone, right? Or the, the spark that it used to contain. And sometimes you need the nail to stick up and you need to push it up a little more, maybe, right? And so I wonder what you would say to that. Is it sometimes actually better to chase the thing that seems out of place rather than just to sort of cut it and say it doesn't belong?
Yeah, absolutely. I call these sore thumbs in the book, right? And there is a tendency to lop them off. There's something that sticks out. And I think that the telltale sign of this is when we get feedback and somebody says, I don't know why that's there. Maybe you don't need it. And so there is a temptation to cut it. So there is a post-workshop sense in which we feel like, well, the things that don't work, I can just take those out. That could be the first step. But sometimes that results in a story that maybe doesn't make many mistakes, but also maybe doesn't have many successes within it at the same time, right? And I often think that sense of, oh, that thing, what work is it doing? I could easily take it out, but why did I put it there in the first place, right? If we can't answer that question, that to me suggests that the intuition or the subconscious has somehow encouraged you to put that in the text, right? That it's there for a reason, but you haven't found the reason yet. So often the way I think into this is, before cutting it, let's see what we could do if we kept it and lent into it and expanded it in various ways. Now, those experiments won't always work. Sometimes the cut is eventually going to happen. But before you make the cut, you need to do it with maybe not perfect information, but certainly better information. If this thing is here, what happens if I lean into it? What happens if I do more with it? And then make the judgment as to whether or not it belongs in the story or otherwise.
Yeah, no, I love that, right? The idea of sore thumbs, right? Don't lop them off, right? Figure out what it is that they're doing there in the first place, right?
Yeah, right.
I like that really dovetails with a thing that a sort of a theory, right, that I've long held, which is that writers talk to themselves in their drafts.
That's a great way of putting it.
Particularly when they don't know how to solve a narrative problem. And sometimes so as an editor, I sometimes see these moments where all of a sudden you just get like sort of like a thick string of questions, like in a paragraph or so. And you go, I just kind of light up and go, oh, what if you actually answer these questions? Like, what if these aren't just rhetorical? Like, why does this, why does the narrator have such a dearth of information? You just don't know. So let's try and answer some of that, right? And because those moments almost seems like that, as you're saying, that's your subconscious pressing up against the problem and saying, like, answer this.
Oh, I love that idea that writers sort of talk to themselves through their drafts. There is, I think, a definite way in which we are trying to sort of learn from what's come before, right? To build on that foundation, to interpret that foundation, I think in certain ways. The trick, though, and the difficult part, I think, often for us, is listening to ourselves and to our stories, right? I think there's a part of us that as we write is so engaged in the talking. We're talking now, I'm talking, I know what I'm saying. But it's harder to stop and listen to your own story and listen to your past self trying to think through a space in various ways. Although the example you're just giving of that plethora of questions arising in a piece of work, which you're right, does often suggest that the writer is asking those questions and maybe the work should begin to think into those questions, right? In a way, that's also something I've been recently talking about with folks in workshop, that the questions a workshop poses can also be drawn back as questions into the manuscript.
Right.
Going back to Chekhov's idea that, it's not always our artistic duty to come up with the answers. Sometimes it's just a case of framing the question, right, in various ways. Yeah. And so even if the reader is wondering what is the question, is raising questions, maybe we can have the narrator think about raising those same questions. At least we acknowledge them as questions that the narrator and the author are themselves engaged in. I think there's a kind of commonality, a kind of fellow feeling that comes with that I think draws reader and writer together.
Mhm, mhm. Make it a productive feature of the work, right? In other words, yeah.
Yeah,
I love
but
that.
this whole notion of questioning, though, does lead me to that idea that in a way, I think every draft is posing questions, right? And it's a way of thinking about progress. It feels like even a draft, a revision that I think we sometimes have that demoralizing sense of I fixed something, I took one step forward, but it raised two new, problems, opened a can of worms, as I sometimes talk about it in conversations with people. So it feels like I took one step forward and two steps back. If we're lucky, sometimes it's one step forward and it feels like five steps back, I think, in some ways, because one change will generate new questions. But the way to think about that is that those are new possibilities. We want our stories to be as rich, as complex as possible, I think, in many ways. And so the idea that new questions are proposed by a draft, that actually seems like a successful draft to me. I think we are so fixated on the final draft. But does that mean that only the final draft is the only successful one? It feels to me like all the interim drafts along the way, as they carry us towards that, are parts of that success as well. So a draft that suggests the need for another draft feels like it's part of that successful process.
Yeah, I I sometimes think of the Peter Matthiessen trilogy and the way that he had written it as a trilogy, and it got sort of stuffed into one book, and then he over the years kind of went back and broke it apart and rewrote them until they were standalone pieces again. In the way that a publication story like that just explodes the notion of it's been released to the world, therefore it's done. Right. It's a choice, I think, to say, okay, now we're done. I'm going to move on to the next project. But for some people, maybe you aren't, right?
Well, right. I mean, I think so much of the time, while we might certainly talk about what doneness looks like in a perfect world, a lot of the time, we are putting out work and it's to do with circumstances, right? I need to finish this book. I have a deadline. I think I'm done. This is as good as I can make it at this point. So the idea that work remains alive for us, that there might be some unfinished business, there might be a different way of thinking about it, that all makes perfect sense to me. And our life circumstances, our historical context, all of those things may change that as well. It's funny, this is not an example that made it into the book, but of course, having written the book, which sort of addresses, as you know, the sense of the invisibility of revision, that most of the time we only ever see final drafts. I'm really interested in trying to unearth examples of revision that are out there, because it feels to me like it is a hidden but also ubiquitous process. And it's useful, I think, for us all to feel as writers this fellow feeling that all these finished books that we see have behind them, revisions and drafts that struggle to get to that polished and beautiful place that we know as the published work. And so the Peter Matthiessen work is part of that exemplar. But I just recently was thinking about this weird but fascinating move, and I haven't read the book yet, I confess. It's the novelization that Quentin Tarantino has written of his movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, right? And as you know, as a kid, when I was growing up, novelizations, particularly of sci-fi movies that wouldn't be released in Britain for like another 6 months, was something I loved as a teenager, right? So I often read the book of blockbuster movies before the movie showed up, which is a weird way to think into that space. And because those books were often written from early drafts of the scripts, not only would they be expansions, but they might also reflect a revision process of the movie itself, right? So there were odd ways of leaning into those territories. And the idea that Tarantino has then novelized his own movie. So it's a revision in a different form, but notionally by the same author. That's fascinating to me, especially as he's providing backstory on characters he doesn't have room to create in the context of the movie. So I'm hoping to look at that myself, but also secretly in a class that I'm going to teach next semester here for my grad students on revision, hoping that one or two of them might choose that as a revision example to explore in some ways and present on.
And you talk really interestingly about this in the book, right? The idea of a story traveling across mediums, right? And the way that revision is thought of differently in some quarters, right? Or some mediums. The notion of retconning, right? or even the idea that like, let's bring revision out into the open and make it again sort of a feature of the work, right? And you talk a little bit about comics, right, and the particular relationship of that practice, right, to those types of narratives, and it reminds me a little bit of the the What If series
Sure, yeah,
that they've got going right now, which is essentially like take all the familiar Marvel characters and spin the dial and say, what if Black Panther, was in fact, right, Star-Lord, right? What happens, right? And so I think, as you're grappling with those things, what can we writers learn from the way that other artists in different mediums think about and approach revision?
Yeah, and in a way for me, and I love the example of What If as well. I hadn't thought into that one before, but that's a perfect example of this, right? And as you know as well, I had a lot of fun writing this book and just geeking out, right? Because it does feel as though we can think about movie sequels and prequels and reboots in all these contexts as well. And while that's a fun, geeky deep dive that satisfies some of my pleasure centers, I suppose, in certain ways, it's also a way of taking this process of revision that can sometimes seem very mysterious and very hidden, and almost mystical, I think, in certain ways, and saying, well, no, it's all around us, and it's inherent even in humble or popular forms of entertainment as well, I think, for us as well. So it feels like it's a way of demystifying it and making it feel very apparent to us. I've been having a lot of fun lately talking about cover versions of songs as well, right? Where we feel that, the words are the same, the lyrics are often the same, but we can feel different tones, different meanings, depending on how they're delivered in those different contexts.
I almost hate to bring this up, but I'm going to do it anyway. There was a tribute album released for Metallica's The Black Album. It's like 50 tracks or more, right? But they're all covers, right, of tracks from the original album. And the best ones were not the ones that tried to recreate the songs, right? The best ones were ones that just did their own weird thing. And so there's a St. Vincent version, right?
Wow, that's wild.
Of a song called Sad But True that, is a big riff guitar song, and it turns it into like all sort of like throbbing bass and sort of like pulsing synth. And it just is amazing, right? But it isn't because they've done it better in the same way than the original. It's because they took that and transmuted it into something entirely different.
Right. And some of the pleasure that you're feeling, right, relies upon us understanding, here is the original, here is the cover version, right? That we are grooving on the space between those and marveling at the invention, the changes. How could you ring the changes upon that in such fascinating ways? And, it doesn't mean that we have to love one more than the other. I think we're just responding to the artistry and the individual expression, I think, in both of those spaces. So that's an example of moments where revision can benefit from being visible, right? We were beginning to talk into this space before. The other that I think of often in a literary context is alternate history narratives, right? Where those texts are relying upon us as we read The Plot Against America or various other texts that operate in those ways, that we know what's supposed to happen. The first draft in that sense is our understanding of history, and the book is a revision upon that. We're sort of feeling the play between those two spaces. So there is, in certain, admittedly sort of limited spaces, this pleasure in the glimpsing of revision, and we're invited to see two versions as if they are, hovering above one another and interacting in certain interesting ways as well.
Mm-hmm. Peter, I love the example that you give, and you do draw on your own work quite a bit in the book, but I love the example of the story about the interracial couple that has had a UFO sighting or alien abduction story, right? And you're talking about that and revising it, and suddenly, of course, you're also thinking, of course, this is about much more than what it appears to be about, and you put in a sort of very light touch of the white sails, right, of the slave ships, as you're thinking about, I'm writing something that is an abduction narrative, that's also dealing with race, it's inherently connected. How had I not seen that before?
Yeah.
So can you talk about that moment where you realize, oh, the thing that is probably painfully obvious to most readers is the one thing that has eluded the writer, until you get to that moment and then you go, oh, if I put this in, now I'm done.
Right. I mean, I would hope it wasn't too painfully obvious.
No.
To the reader. But actually, that's a great description, though, of the process by which intuition rises to the surface, I think, through, in fact, an act of reading in many cases. So that is my alien abduction story. It's based, if one believes in such things, on at least a true account, a published account that came out in the 60s, reasonably famous from the time it was even made into a TV movie, I think, starring James Earl Jones. And I think what first attracted me to that was that this early abduction experience or case occurred to a mixed race couple, a white woman, black man, New England, in the early 60s. And partly because I'm part of a mixed marriage, I'm a product of a mixed marriage, I'm often thinking into those spaces. I was interested in that territory. And I've been thinking at that time about trying to write about race, but to do so in sort of sidelong ways, to come at it in different and surprising ways, to surprise myself, maybe in the ways I was engaging with it, I think in certain ways. So I intuited in that story, maybe I was thinking about, this is a childless couple, they're encountering little gray aliens, about ways in which race might factor into this story. But it felt like an intuition, nothing that I could have quite crystallized or put my finger on. And of course, to some degree, I was trading in alien abduction lore familiar to us, again, in a kind of pleasurably geeky way from things like the X-Files and other sources along those lines. And only as I worked through this case, and of course, it's in a way, one of those cases that shape that mythology that we have to this day, that it occurred to me that some of the descriptions of being led to a ship under hypnosis, being tied up, it's a great white ship, typically in these narratives, a captive is examined, their teeth are examined, the genitals is examined, all these kind of questions, that this imagery felt suddenly to me, and this is a readerly insight, it felt as though it echoed the imagery we think about in terms of slave narratives or abductions from Africa. And when I saw that, and I don't know if this is true, but as a thought experiment, the idea that our obsession with alien abduction felt like it was a way in which our anxieties about race and racial history had gone underground and re-emerged in popular culture. That suddenly felt like what this story was about. And crucially, what it had always been about, and that it took me until the very end of that process to recognize it and change it. And as you say, it was a change of one line in the story. I'm not even sure that necessarily makes it clearer to the reader, but it felt as though I was acknowledging my own final understanding of what I had been trying to write all along. And that got us to that question of doneness. I felt like I finally saw what had been there all along. It had been inherent in the story from the get-go, but that I had only intuited and not been conscious of in terms of my understanding of it.
Yeah. So in some ways, maybe the revision process is an understanding process, re-understanding or something like that, right?
Yeah, right. The understanding of our work and our characters, but in some fundamental way about ourselves, I think, right? It's an understanding of what was that intuitive spark that led me here? What might it be if I could finally figure out what that meant to me, I think, in some ways as well.
Yeah, that's lovely. I want to shift gears a little bit here. We've been, talking, theoretically, I think, in a lot of ways. I want to shatter that a little bit and talk a bit about technology, right? And the ways that that's shaped revision, right? You bring up at one point, the idea that, it means something different to cut and paste when it once actually meant that you were there with your scissors and your tape, right? And your glue. And now it just means that you're, moving around on the keyboard and the mouse and moving things around in a virtual space. You also bring up the idea of the draft, right? If someone says, what is revision? You say, oh, I write it, then I write it again, then I write it again, and I call these things drafts, right? But technology has changed, maybe, revision to the point that the notion of draft might not be the most useful concept anymore. So I wonder if you just try and take a crack at this. How has technology started to change the way that we revise? And ought we maybe to be trying to use some different terminology?
That's really interesting.
Say the draft?
I think the way to, yeah, I mean, the way to think into that, I think, is, I think back in the day when people are doing this on a typewriter or doing it longhand, there are a pile of papers, right? That is a draft. Exactly. When I start draft 2, I roll a blank piece of paper into the typewriter and I start again, right? And there's going to be another pile of paper and I'm going to look, pile 1 is draft 1, pile 2 is draft 2. I'm going to have these discrete piles of paper along the way. As we do this on the computer, even, as writers who grew up on the typewriter, like Philip Roth have talked about, as he began to move into word processing, he recognized the drafts began to disappear into one another in a certain sense. So now it feels as though what we call drafts feel almost as though they are arbitrary slices on a continuum, I think, in certain ways as well. It's the slice that I printed out for workshop. It's the slice that I felt like I brought as far as I could for that particular date and that particular deadline. Here it is, right? So it feels as though it's not that we necessarily need to abandon the term draft, but we might want to think about it as not this discrete object, but something that's on a line as we move through the work. And maybe also to think about it being a little arbitrary. I think there is the throwback here, the question becomes, it's formulated often by students or in Q&As, how many drafts should I write of this story, right? Which is how long is a piece of string kind of question, right? In many ways, but you feel bogus by saying 5 or 10 because those numbers don't matter. I think Colson Whitehead has a great joke because writers, of course, in their own weirdly little competitive ways, like to say, oh, I wrote 50 drafts of this one, and the rest of us are going, I only wrote 3, and so we feel somehow diminished. But I think Colson's joke is that, well, change a sentence, print it out again, you've got a new draft, and you can build the number of drafts because he's pointing to the absurdity of trying to think about the number. The number doesn't really matter. So that might be the thing to de-emphasize, I think, in various ways. And because, in the book, we talk a little bit about technology, the ways in which, word processing especially, and I'm just old enough to sort of have started on a typewriter, the crudity of my admittedly also very bad typing meant that manuscript on a page looked like this needs work. It looked messy. It had, whiteout all over it. It was smudged. It was just a mess. When I do that on the screen, the great revelation for all of us when we first come to word processing is, man, that looks great. That looks really professional. Right. And the danger is it sometimes looks a little bit more professional than it really is. It looks more polished because we can nicely justify the fonts. We can choose a nice font than it does. It looks better than it reads, looks better than it is, I think. So that can be something of a false artifact from that word processing process for us all as well. I think you were thinking into one of our preliminary questions before, when we were chatting before this, about how technology has shaped my own writing. And I was thinking about that, and so it does go back a little bit to my time starting on the typewriter. But I think even to this day, because I began on a manual, and because I never learned to touch type, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm still, I think I'm a very fast hunt and pecker, but that's kind of how I go at the typing. And there's a part of me that thinks that mechanical limitation for me has actually worked out okay. I think I mostly type slowly, but therefore at the speed that I think at, which is also somewhat slow. If I typed faster, I think I would be exceeding my thought speed actually in certain ways as well. So for me, the technological limitation, or my limitation in engaging with it, feels like it's about right for my writing process.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I'm so curious about this is because I think the process at which everybody arrives at what they call a first draft, at which point they'll say, okay, now I'm going to begin revising, is radically different. You have the people that, churn out, a first draft really, really rapidly, and it's really rough, right? They don't worry about paragraphing, right? They don't worry about, throwing quotes around the dialogue, any of that stuff, right? When there's a character name, they just put, like insert here and they keep going, right? And then
or the name of a family member.
Right. Oh, and then you have writers who edit as they go, in a manner of speaking. They write a paragraph and then they go back and they rework it and rework it and rework it until it actually feels like something that wouldn't be in a first draft, but in, draft 3 or 4 or 5 or what have you, right? So that first draft looks so wildly different for all those different writers. And so given that, right, I think it's interesting to think about, okay, but what are the mechanical ways that we can force ourselves to think of the thing as still messy, right?
Yeah.
I think writers are a very flexible and adaptive bunch. I've heard right, writers kicking around ideas on Twitter to the effect that I make myself use Times New Roman because it's so ugly. I know it tells me the truth, right? It's just like, man, if you wade into the waters of Garamond or Baskerville or what have you, then the thing looks like it's published, right? As you were saying. So I do think that's interesting though, right? Finding ways even within a new technology to say, this thing isn't done. Yeah. And that certainly has something to do with what you're familiar with and what looks finished and what doesn't, right? And a font choice.
Yeah, no, I love that idea.
It has nothing to do with that, right?
Yeah, no, it reminds me of a number of things. On the one hand, as we talk a little bit about in the book, there are writers who try and slow the process down, right? So seeing it in a different font, making yourself see it in a different font. I used to like Courier because it looked like that typewriter font, and it looked a little rougher, and because it took up a bit more space on the page, so it felt like I was more productive than I really was in some ways, right? But I wrote 2 pages a day, even though it might have only been a page and a half in a different font. But it also felt drafty, I think, which I think helped me remain fairly flexible in respect to it. And maybe there's even a way in which when we get used to a particular font, the pace on the page of, this scene took 2 pages in that font starts to feel natural to us in various ways. If you change the font, maybe our pacing is knocked off, I think, in various ways as well. And because I'm also thinking here a little bit about writers who, vary their technological engagement with their work. So they might start a first draft, write a first draft on a legal pad, type it up on the computer, go back to writing it longhand for a 3rd draft. And then I think, there are instances cited in the book of people who will then dictate it into a dictaphone and listen back to it to see and hear different things in that space. I'm really interested in, the way that a draft, which of course begins as a kind of sheet of wet cement, right? It's flexible, it's malleable, but then it hardens on us. It takes on a kind of inevitability. It feels harder to think all these choices that were flexible are now fixed in place. But we need to find ways of continually maintaining that sort of flexibility, that plasticity of the work. And so seeing it in different ways, apprehending it through different sense organs, if I'm always seeing it on the page, it begins to feel again set in stone. If I read it aloud to myself, I'm forced to embody it and also apprehend it through a different sensory organ, no longer just through my eyes, but also through my ears, I think, in some ways. You hear, you learn different things. It's a different way of not just re-seeing in this case, but rehearing in a sense, right? But that shift of perspective feels really interesting. The last thing on this, I like that distinction you're making between writers who, rush through a first draft, right? As I think many of us do. I think we're racing against our own self-doubt in that idea. Got to get to the end because at least then I got something, building a bridge over the chasm of our self-doubt. And those who, build maybe more carefully, more slowly, building forward and building a firm foundation. Each step is sort of built on the last in various ways. The thing I would say though is that I think we are none of us a singular writer in that sense of the process. We are all of those things. So often even in the same draft, we will go at different paces, right? I'm starting out, I'm a little tentative, I'm not quite sure where it's going. I'm going to go slowly, build very carefully. I have a sense now of where I'm going. I can see something, maybe the climax of this scene, it's suddenly very exciting. The pace picks up, I move much more rapidly in various ways. now I've arrived at a point where I don't quite know what happens next. So I guess I'll slow down and hang around until I figure it out, right? So we tend to move in these phases where we go, quick, slow sometimes along the way. And even draft by draft, we can go very quickly through the first draft because we want to sort of beat that doubt. But often once we've got a rough first draft out, we can slow down and we can really assert our patience into those spaces as well as we revise.
Yeah. There's a moment in the book, Peter, where you talk about the sort of like expansion and contraction process of revision, right? And you say, well, does this mean that we're all essentially putter-inners or taker-outers? But you bring it back to the body, right? And talk about sort of breathing in and breathing out. And the breathing in and out, so the breathing in and out of the story has always allowed the writer to locate its heart. We're used to talking of climaxes taking our breath away or making us catch our breath, but the right ending can also make us exhale, sigh with aesthetic satisfaction. So, that passage makes me think, we're used to thinking of revision as such a cerebral thing, right? The domain of the intellect, but, that makes it sound a lot more like maybe what we're trying to do is process the story in our body, so that it can come out again more complete or more whole. That there's something really actually physical in the act of revision that makes it work rather than it being purely intellectual, right? And the way that you were talking about those, those physical processes of revision, I've got to engage it in different tactical, physical, sensory ways. It made me think that maybe there is in fact something to this idea.
There might be. You're making me think a little bit of Norman Mailer years ago. I used to see him, this is 20 years ago, but he would already then have been probably in his 70s, jogging around Provincetown, very, very slowly. But I'll be so lucky if I can do it at that age. And I remember reading somewhere where he thought you have to get in training to write a novel, right? So he was very much thinking about the physical stamina in order to write a novel. So there is something, I think, embodied in the writing process in various ways. But I think the way I think about that metaphor, and of course, these are all metaphors of the revision process. And in a sense, hopefully different metaphors help us to see it in different ways, right? To release different ideas for readers of the book, is to think of the story or the novel in front of us as a living thing, that it's able to breathe out and breathe in, that revision is not necessarily about putting a pin in it, right? In a certain sense, pinning it to the board, but allowing it to grow and develop and allowing ourselves to watch it do those things as it grows and as it develops, I think, in some ways as well. It's funny, I was just thinking back on some of the ways, we talk about, it's even there in that first Ben Percy quote, right? Where he's like, we're locking off limbs, we're going to call down the lightning to bring it back to life. There's a kind of Dr. Frankenstein's quality of that, but there's also a kind of butchery and a surgery. And I think we do think of revision very often in these murderous ways. Kill your darlings, right? Murder your little darlings in Virginia Woolf's framing of that phrase. And there's a lot about this surgery, this cutting, this butchery, scalpels. We think about all these knife images, I think, in various ways. And they seem combative. It feels as though we're dissecting something which is already dead, which is maybe not the healthiest way to think into that space. So I'm interested in again, not to say that any metaphor is the right one, but if we're always too wedded to one, we maybe don't see other potentials within the work. I'm also reminded here of, some of these metaphors feel pretty male, right? They're violent metaphors. In certain ways, so I think Claire Massoud has the idea of it's a metaphor of cooking, of distilling work, getting the flavors in a sauce, and that feels like another interesting way that's somehow less brutalizing than the idea of just going to cut this off and lop it apart. That feels like a different way of thinking into that space. And again, none of these are right, but I think collectively all of them can help us see in different ways, see the process in different ways.
Would it be fair to say then that that everyone should feel that they can come up with their own terminology that works for their particular revision process rather than just locking into the accepted mode?
Yeah, so this does not attempt to be a how-to book, right? Because it's thinking into, here are some various strategies, things that I think about, but in that idea of revision as a way in which we learn to understand our own work, learn to understand ourselves, learn to revise ourselves as writers in certain ways, right? The writer who finally finishes a story is a different writer from the one who began it. So that's part of that revision process. That would also suggest that for each of us, being attentive to our own revision process, so attentive to things that work for us, listening to those intuitions and then interrogating those intuitions. It's a very personal journey, I think, in those regards as well.
So it looks like we have a question from the audience for you, Peter. So Rachel wants to know, what if the writer is writing about a particular unique culture that few know intimately? How does one find a good editor, since most come from the majority culture and have little understanding of the specific issues of the culture they don't know?
Yeah, so this is getting into that space of thinking about, say, sensitivity readers in various ways, or finding audience members who might be able to speak into the community that we're writing from, I think, in certain ways. That is very helpful, because we're always thinking about authenticity, and also thinking, I think, about being respectful to the spaces that we're writing about. But at the same time, I think it's worthwhile remembering that, so I have an idea that when we tell stories, we are telling them almost inevitably and always for a couple of different audiences. We're telling them from the audience that is familiar with the space that we're engaging with, but we're also telling it to the audience that is not familiar with that space as well. And some part of the communication of self or of a community is trying to reach out and communicate to those who don't know this space as well. So there's a sense in which I think we are always in this odd space of looking back and looking forward, looking inwards and looking outwards at the same time. So the idea of an audience that may not understand this space, that's still an audience. We want to communicate to that space, and there's value in doing that. It's not I think there's occasionally this feeling of, oh, we're selling out if we communicate to the audience that is not from the culture that we're in. And yet I think that's part of what we're trying to do. We're trying to communicate ourselves to others. I think in this context about narratives of the Holocaust, I don't think Jewish writers convey the horror of the Holocaust to remind other Jewish writers and readers of the horrors of the Holocaust. I think those people remember those all too well. I think they're trying to remind the rest of us of the horrors of the Holocaust. And I think that's an extremely important ethical step to undertake.
We have another question from Rebecca. That is, has your revision experience affected your approach to writing a first draft? Revision feels like a dynamic, changing process. I've learned across books to revise, but when it comes to first drafts, my process never seems to evolve.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. I do take heart, probably across the course of several books and several stories, that the messiness of a first draft, which always feels daunting and horrible and makes one want to feel like one's going to give up, is fairly common to most first drafts. And so even though I might be looking at a first draft and going, oh, this looks horrible, what is the point of going on with this? I remember that I've had that feeling about just about everything I've ever written. And at least some of those things have come to fruition. So there's kind of an emboldening, I think, in that space as well. And yet there's also a way in which that kind of horror we sometimes feel about a messy first draft is part of the process, right? That in some ways, if we can't stand to look at it because it has fallen so far short of our ideal of it, putting it aside feels natural and maybe less painful than going on with it. But I think what tends to happen is we put it aside for a while. Maybe we forget our original intent for it. Maybe forget our platonic ideal for where that book was going or that story was going. And then we return to it with different eyes. We read it for what it is, not what we wanted it to be, not what we were maybe forcing it to be in some ways as well. And maybe those eyes are the eyes of its reader rather than the ideas of its writer that thinks it knows what the work is trying to do, I think, in various ways as well.
Great. So we have one more question. I think you kind of answered it, but previously, but I'll ask it. Referring to the chopping off of limbs as a metaphor that's inherently masculine and violent, what metaphor would you use to describe the revision process?
Well, so, as I say, for me, I like that sense of the idea of a story breathing in and out, that it's this living thing in certain ways. We were talking about sore thumbs, and so I suppose I would say rather than lopping them off, I always feel like it's like sore thumbs up. We should waggle them a little bit as well, and just see what they do in various ways. So there are playful ways of thinking into this. And I guess what I would say is, in a broader sense, we are, all of us as writers, often in an unholy hurry to be finished with our work. It's partly because the actual writing experience is challenging and is difficult to us. So for all that we claim to love writing, and we do. We often really mean we claim to love having written. And so we are impatient for doneness, I think, in various ways. So the struggle often in revision is, how do I preserve my patience to keep working on this, to resist that sense of encroaching impatience, that eagerness to be finished prematurely with the work? And so there are a lot of ways of doing that. Patience feels, again, it makes me feel a little like, a parent saying, oh, just be more patient. And it's less about that. I think it's more about leaning into questions of, what is the pleasure here? What is the fun here? What is the excitement here? What is the discovery here? Those things feel like incentives. They're not about some kind of, I just have to hang around in this boring space for as long as it takes. They're about, no, this space is not boring. This space is dynamic, thrilling, and engaging for us. And having some willingness to do that. And even if those discoveries mean that occasionally it feels like, oh, everything I've just discovered has changed the story. It makes me feel like it's further from being done. And yet it may also be closer to being the story that you really ultimately are trying to write.
All right, so it looks like we've reached the top of the hour. Thank you again to Peter and Steve for joining us on At Home with Literati, a reminder by the Art of Revision. The link is in the chat. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Steve. Good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Megan.